Good morning, everyone. My name's Helen McIntosh, and I'm the president of the South East London Chamber of Commerce. We're absolutely delighted to be having our third webinar with Digital Greenwich Connect on the subject of security in the cloud era. So without any more further ado, I'm going to hand over to Justin Robinson. Over to you, Justin.
Thanks very much indeed, Helen. Good morning, everybody. So yes, this is the third in our series of three webinars on how what it means to be a digital business. They all eventually come back to the requirement for excellent fibre-based connectivity, but we want to educate and inform as well. So, as Helen quite rightly said, this is going to be a security-based subject matter. And as we were aware of Brian doing his this time last week, we wanted to make it a complementary. So we're focusing in on security in the cloud era. It used to be that all of your data sat in a little box with flashing lights in your server room and or under your coffee table, and everything was fine because everything lived there and you could secure that, you knew where it was, and you could put various pieces of equipment in front of it. But that is no longer the way the world works. We're a far more distributed world now, and our data is literally everywhere, whether that's specifically in a cloud like Azure or AWS, Amazon Web Services, or whether it lives in Salesforce or Workday or the multitude of cloud-based applications that you use. So securing it has become a very specific task. So I'm going to hand over to Charles, who's going to present the slides on this subject matter, and then if there are any questions, please pipe up. We're all about questions, so very happy to do that, and then I'll pick things up at the end just to kind of top and tail. Charles, over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Justin. Good morning, all. Hope you had a nice bank holiday weekend. You can see several people seem to still be on it because we're a bit light on numbers. Just a little brief introduction to me. I did one last time when I did the second webinar. I founded a company called Connect You back in 2010. So that's 13 coming on 14 years old now, providing data center services. So hosting, infrastructure, network, and security indeed, for mission critical applications, ranging from small customers who are migrating things out of their offices off premise into a data center environment, to people doing cloud, voice services, all sorts of different hosted infrastructure. As time moved on, requirements changed, and I was asked by several of those customers to start doing business to business connectivity and services, so opening it up to the wider London area. And today, 3 years ago, I launched a brand called GWiz Networks in 2020, which delivers that business-to-business connectivity and telecoms piece, covering all of central London, about 70% of inner London, and more relevant to us, most of the southeast, including Greenwich, Bexley, Bromley, Croydon, and Merton boroughs. So pretty good coverage all the way out. And now working with ITS and Digital Greenwich Connect to deliver those solutions for businesses across the borough. So I've been working in hosted environments and data centers for, good long 14, 15 years probably now. And security has certainly got a lot more complicated over that time. Cloud has been around, as we established last time, for a good sort of, coming on 10 years now. But that's evolved and things have got a lot more complicated. There's a lot more doors potentially open now for miscreants to get into. So this presentation is to supplement Brian's last Wednesday, and to look a little bit more about how we protect the network, how we protect your assets, and sorts of things that maybe you could be thinking about, maybe give you a brief introductory education into the way that sort of cybersecurity professionals start their journey and the way that they start to think. Okay, so next slide, please, Catherine. So what is the whole purpose of doing cybersecurity? Well, first of all, let's understand why we need it. And that's because attackers are mostly criminals these days. It's very, very rare that we find script kiddies in their bedrooms who are coming out to get your business. There's a few script kiddies around that attack things just for the fun of it, but they're not really likely to be landing on your small or medium business in the Greenwich Borough. So they're mostly criminal organizations, and they're out there to make money. Bottom line, they're out there to steal your data, to exploit it, potentially for their own benefit, or to sell it on to others. They're out there to hold you to ransom with your data. So they'll lock it away, they'll encrypt it so you can't access it. They'll threaten to destroy it, and they'll ask you for money in return for releasing it. Or they might potentially be out there just to cause disruption to competitors. So probably less likely with your small business, but there are cases certainly out there where large corporates can employ these people in a very black market way to go and cause disruption to other companies and their competitors, and therefore increase their bottom line. So probably really in your small and medium business in Greenwich, we're looking at how to protect your data and how to avoid you being held to ransom. Those are the two main things. Second point to make really is that, again, as a small business, you're not really that interesting to these people. You're only really interesting if you're an easy target. Most of these attacks are going to be opportunistic. They're going to be browsing around, seeing what they can find, and finding that your business is easy to exploit, and therefore making you a target. They're not out to get you specifically. It's nothing personal. So really our goal is to kind of make you unattractive. So we won't make you as difficult as possible, put as many hurdles in the way of these bad people, so that you're no longer of interest to them or leave you alone. That said, nobody can guarantee 100% that everything that's put in place will make you 100% secure. The reason I say that is, for example, if somebody's really determined to get to some data in your organization, they could turn to physical threats, for example, against members of staff, bribery, collusion, to get what they want. So there's only so far that we can really go in cybersecurity to protect you. And as I say, that's really to stop those opportunistic attacks more than it is to stop somebody who's absolutely determined to get at something in your business, which is going to be very, very few and far between and highly rare. Next thing that we want to do in cybersecurity is pool our resources. There's a large global footprint of attacks going on all over the place, mostly from a few certain countries in the world, in the East, really. Russia and China, for example, being two, North Korea. We really want to study the attack patterns that they use across the globe, and then be able to leverage those same patterns, those same techniques, and protect you from them wherever you are in the world. So it's important to work with a company that has a global presence, with a vendor that has a global security team that are constantly monitoring these threats and are able to update your equipment in almost real time to protect you from the latest emerging trends and threats. And finally, it's an interesting point and harps very much back to Brian's presentation from last week, that we can put lots of technology in place, but fundamentally, a lot of the breaches come down to human error or weaknesses. And it's very important, therefore, that you get some education and training into all of your staff to help them follow good processes, good practices, spot obvious things, and don't fall for the tricks that some of these attackers will use to try and get into your network. Okay, next, please. So I thought it'd be kind of fun to pitch this looking back in time. There's a lot of the digital techniques that we use today have their origins in physical security that was used probably back to the Roman era, the Greek era, but I'm going to go back to the medieval era about 1,000 years ago. Reminds me very much of playing a game. You may recognize this. This is Age of Empires 2, which came out about 10 years ago. I tried to get this running on a new machine recently, running Linux rather than Windows. That was a challenge, I can tell you, but managed to get there in the end. I thought I'd do a sort of presentation, start off with just some rudiments of how you might protect your little village from 1,000 years ago in physical reality, and then we'll adapt that and see how we do that digitally instead. So on the screen here, I've got a little village. We've got some civilians and civilian population on the right-hand side with a couple of houses. We've got a military installation in the center, and we've got some trade going on the left-hand side. The trade area is representing here sharing things that you produce or importing things that you need from the outside world. The civilians are, let's say, the staff in your business or some of the internal systems in your business, and the military are more of the important and sensitive secret installation targets within your business. And this little town that we've got here represents your small company and the things that are going on inside it. So the problem here is this is wide open to the world. It can get attacked from any side with no warning. There's no defenses of any kind. And if you just sit your business on the internet with no thought, then this is the kind of scenario that you'll find yourself in. primed to attack from anywhere at any time with no warning. So what should we be doing? Well, next slide, please, Catherine. We should be fortifying our little town, all of our assets. And typically the things that you would do for that are to add some walls in. That's going to be a good defense. Stop people getting in the perimeter, stop them coming in from the outside, certainly without your knowledge anyway. We might add a moat around it. That just makes it a little bit more difficult again. And then we're going to add a drawbridge, say. That stops people coming in unless we want them to come in. And it also funnels them down one specific route so that we can see exactly who's coming in. We only have one place that we have to monitor rather than trying to monitor everything all around us at the same time, which is an extremely difficult task. Secondly, the trade outpost that we had that does need to share things from the world, that sits outside our walls, but it's still within our boundaries, so we can still monitor it. So it's less guarded than the rest because we need it to be open with the world. We need to share things with the world around us in the digital age. That's data. Back then, that was goods. But we don't want it to be as big part of our inside our town, because that would make our town vulnerable to attack from the outside. So we're starting to think about how to separate things out, how to wall them off, how to put barriers in the way of people that want to attack us. In addition, we use some gates in the walls there just to allow traffic to come in and out, but to monitor it, to regulate it, to allow only what we want to come in and out of our little town. Okay, next slide, please, Catherine. And then we go further. And this is a technique in cybersecurity that's called defense in depth. And the idea is to keep adding hurdles, keep adding barriers and layers into our defense, which makes it more and more difficult for those coming from the outside to get into, if you like, our very sensitive inner areas of our business. That would be where your key data is stored, for example. So what have we done here? Well, we've fortified it even further. We've added more walls inside the town. We've now added a wall down the middle. We've split up the civilian population, which perhaps is not guarded. It's just your average Joe pondering around, from our sensitive military installation, where maybe we've got secrets going on, maybe we've got war battle plans being made. We don't want those to be overheard by the rest of the general population, who perhaps are more open to bribery and couldn't be trusted, for example. We've added some watchtowers in there and some defense towers to add protection. And then interestingly, we've also added, I don't know if you could see them very clearly, just at the top of the bridge and in front of the gates, we've added some troops there, some soldiers to protect from any incoming forces, but also to examine and inspect those forces as they come in. The idea being that we're adding checkpoints now in. So we're not just letting things come in or out on a very broad terms. We're actually able to inspect, say, individuals who come into the network. We could be looking at them for concealed weapons, for example, which might be akin to malware, or we might be looking for suspicious behavior. What are they up to? Are they looking a bit odd? That's something that we tend to call intrusion prevention. We're looking for someone who's doing something a little bit odd in your town or your network. Maybe, particularly we think last few years, we're looking for signs of an infection. Do they have a fever or a high temperature? Could they be bringing a horrible plague into our town that we don't want? So that would be akin to a sort of antivirus. We're looking at people as they come in and make sure they're not going to cause us any trouble when inside. And also, as a side point, if we want to share, trade, and maybe messages with other towns and friendly cities, we would want to send those on, say, a horse rider out of our town. We'd want to make sure those messages were coded in case they got intercepted on the way. And of course, as you probably know, that's what we do with digital communications today. We encrypt them end to end so that anything that does get intercepted is pretty much useless to the person who receives them in the middle. So this is kind of the general idea. So you can think about this as we go along as a sort of a very easy to accessible analogy to what we're doing in cybersecurity. We're adding layers, defenses. We're thinking at multiple points how we can check things that are going on all of the time. So let's have a look at a typical small business network from today. Next, please, Catherine. Whenever I go into a very small business today, I typically find that they're using the stock router that they've been provided by their ISP, or maybe it's something they bought from a small business vendor off the shelf. And this router tends to split the network into two areas, three if we count the outside. So I've depicted this here with a little firewall in the middle and three areas or zones, as we often call them, of where traffic sits. So first of all, you've got your very much untrusted internet side. So that's your wide area network, the thing that you plug into when you connect to the internet, everything that's outside in the big wide world. And then inside that, you've got a LAN environment, the local area network, where you tend to have all of your stuff connected. So your PCs, your phones, your Wi-Fi, your printers, your CCTV. You might have other things. For example, if you're a small cafe or restaurant, you might have card machines, till systems. They tend to all just be plugged into this one internal network called the LAN, and all on the one system. And everything there is trusted broadly. Anything that's on the inside is seen to be good, and anything on the outside is seen to be bad, with the exception maybe of one guest network, which is often now included as standard in typical routers. They'll give you an extra Wi-Fi, what we call SSID, an extra Wi-Fi network name for the guest network, which keeps anyone that's visiting separate from the rest of your infrastructure. But this is not fantastic. It's not fantastic because everything that's in that LAN is now trusted together. And really, it probably shouldn't be. So whenever I walk into a new client today, regardless of their size, I'm looking at the sorts of devices that they've got, the sorts of things that they do in the business and the processes they need to follow, and how we could try to, as we did with our civilization, add more walls, add more barriers, add more layers. We're trying to stop someone who gets in from the internet to one compromised device from just spreading everywhere. So if you could go to the next slide, please, Catherine. This is an example from typical restaurant customers. Various of them have followed the same pattern here. So instead of having a single internal network where everything is on it, we start to split that network up into pieces. So for example, in the bottom segment there, we've got telephones. Well, there's no reason for telephones to be on the same physical network as CCTV or credit card processing. They don't need to talk together. They're really nothing to do with each other. So what we want to do is to add walls between different things that do different jobs and segment them down. And that narrows our vision as well for how to protect those, so we can be more specific. So in this case, we've separated phones from CCTV, from a sound system. Sonos is a typical one that restaurants and cafe environments use, but that's a Wi-Fi and a networked sound system that also talks to the internet. Potentially that could be vulnerable to attack from someone outside. Credit card systems, EPOS, till, waitress ordering tablet systems. And then we still have our staff network LAN like we had before, but it's now much smaller in that bottom left corner. We've shrunk it right down to the bare minimum that we need, which is staff PCs and printers and Wi-Fi for the odd staff device, mobile phone, for example, that we bring in. And we've still got our guest Wi-Fi for all the visitors to our cafe or restaurants as well that want to use the Wi-Fi hotspot. Again, totally isolated from the rest of the network. So ultimately, segmentation, micro-segmentation, sometimes going down a really fine grain, is kind of what we're trying to do, whether it's a medieval village from 1,000 years ago or whether it's digital today. We're trying to make things more narrow. We're trying to think about the devices that we have in our network and how we can best secure those and isolate them. And all of this traffic will go through that firewall in the middle. It's responsible for absolutely everything in the network. So let's have a little look about a bit more about that firewall, because we can do better than just an age-old firewall that splits things up. We can make that firewall much more intelligent. Next slide, please, Catherine. And for years now, we've had in the market things called next-generation firewalls, which today is a bit of a misnomer because they're today's generation firewalls, but back sort of 6 years ago, 7 years ago, they really were next generation. And the idea is that these don't just allow traffic to go between those zones or to go from your inside to the internet, but they actually inspect the traffic. They do very clever things to that traffic as it passes through. So it's akin to the village where we have the soldiers who inspect at the gates, the people who come in and out looking for weapons and suspicious behavior. We're not just letting people in and out based on the fact they have an appointment. We're actually doing a bit more examination of them. So what do? Well, they include tools, for example, such as anti-malware and antivirus, which obviously scan the traffic coming in and out, looking for signatures of infections that may be able to spread through your network, or potentially could be, you could use that malware to lock up your data, for example, in a ransomware attack. Intrusion prevention, which is looking for suspicious behavior. So it's traffic that we'd normally allow, but it looks a bit odd. For example, somebody who's trying 100 times a second to log into one of your systems is probably not a real human. It's probably someone trying to brute force their way in with guessing the passwords. So that's something with intrusion prevention would look at that and say, that doesn't look like normal behavior. I'm going to block that. certainly going to let you know about it. Web filtering. So, for example, disallowing the access of your employees to sites that are known to contain malware or known to be phishing attacks. So fake bank logins, for example. Might be disallowing certain types of adult material. Might also want to disallow certain applications like torrenting, for example. It's one we do in restaurants a lot. Sometimes you get someone who comes into the coffee shop, they sit down, use the Wi-Fi, they start downloading a movie, and the owner gets slapped with a DCMA. That's a Digital Copyright Millennium Act request from one of the companies like Warner Brothers that says you've been illegally downloading our films. Well, it's not their fault. They don't want anything to do with that. So we'll protect the Wi-Fi by adding in some filtering on that to make sure that torrenting, for example, is disallowed on the guest networks. Nobody can access that. That just helps to protect them from any potential legal claims coming later as well. And lastly, data loss prevention, which is a big topic in itself. But fundamentally what this is let's say someone's accessed your network, they tried to grab some data, they've got a whole load of credit card details and they're trying to leave the network with it. Well, that can scan that information it's leaving and go, well, that's odd because this looks like a lot of credit card information. I don't think we should be sending that, and block sending it out of the network. So again, another layer there of defense, more on an egress out of the network more than in, but to prevent some of your important information from going missing. All of the traffic coming in and out of the network and between all of those segmented zones all goes through the firewall, and that allows it to monitor everything in the conversation that's going on, as well as walling off all of those zones that we talked about previously, checking the traffic at every point. So we're adding in checkpoints as we go. And the last point on this slide is to always apply what we call the principle of least privileges. And this is kind of what we've been doing from the beginning of this discussion. We want to allow things to work, but only in the minimal way possible. We don't want to allow everything to talk to everything all of the time. It's allowing too much access in the network, and it allows somebody who's managed to get inside to jump from one place to another, to another, to another, and spread like a virus across your network. The more we isolate things down, the tighter we make controls and policies, the more difficult it is for someone who's got inside to move around inside. So the example with segmentation might be a dodgy printer driver. Let's say someone unknowingly has downloaded a printer driver for the laser printer in the office that actually happens to be already infected with a virus, with a backdoor. It's allowing someone now to access that printer device from the outside world. What we don't want them to be able to do is then to go from the printer to the payment systems or the tills or the very highly secure data storage in the comms room, and therefore to gain access to those systems and start exploiting those more valuable systems. So by locking everything down, narrowing it down, isolating it, segmenting it, we make sure that really getting into the printer is not a big deal. We can solve that problem relatively easily, and we haven't had any other major side effects as a result of it. We'll go to the next slide, please, Catherine. Next slide is pretty much that in diagrammatic form. So we've got our internet on the outside. We've got all of those same segmented zones that we had before around the edge. We've got our next generation firewall in the middle, and then we've got layers of more intelligent software protection, the intrusion prevention, malware filtering, data loss prevention out from that. And they're protecting all of our inside zones all the time, looking at that traffic that's going in and out, giving it an inspection, asking it questions, if you like, interrogating it, working out whether it should be allowed or blocked. But there's still a problem with this, and that is if somebody does get into the inside, there's nothing necessarily to stop them, as I said, moving from one device in that particular zone to another. So let's say a printer in the office to a PC in the office, because they're all in that same trusted zone. So we've locked it down a lot, but we haven't quite locked it down enough. And when there's devices in that same zone and they're all trusted, we call that implicit trust. Next slide, please, Catherine. Implicit trust, as I said before, is we segmented everything into those different zones, but there's an implicit trust within each zone that devices are allowed to safely communicate with each other. And as I said, what that allows attackers to do is to jump from one device to another, to another, to another, potentially, if those devices have weaknesses. And that's a technique that hackers call pivoting, to pivot from one place to another around the network. And sometimes devices will need to be able to communicate with each other. For example, your PC with your printer, if they can't talk, you can't print anything. But other times they don't need to be able to. So, for example, one of the employees' mobile phones that's on the staff network probably doesn't need to be able to talk to the PC on the network. So we're constantly looking at how we can also tighten up individual devices as well. Next slide, please, Catherine. And this is the same thing in diagrammatic form. So what we achieved with segmentation was to break the network up into individual pieces to disallow communication between those different zones so that we can't be at risk of somebody pivoting between one zone and another. But within that bottom left staff zone, everything is trusted. So PC talks to printer, talks to Wi-Fi, everything talks to each other. Potentially that leaves us slightly vulnerable to an attack there. So what's the solution to this, or one of the solutions that's come out of it? It's called zero trust. The idea being that we trust nothing at all. Doesn't matter whether it's on a single zone network, which we think is trusted, we don't trust it one bit. Next slide, please, Catherine. If we just, before we start the technical digital side, if we think back to our village for a minute, what is zero trust? It's almost akin to every visitor that comes to our village is escorted by an armed guard everywhere that they go. So they're constantly monitored for everything that they do. They're constantly being rechecked everywhere they go. Maybe that armed guard has a temperature monitor, probably not 1,000 years ago, but today, and they're constantly checking their temperature to see if they've suddenly got a fever that may be a sign of an infection emerging. So that's really the idea of zero trust. Rather than having some implicit trust in certain parts of our network, we trust nothing any of the time. And that solves some of the weaknesses of just simply splitting up the network and physically walling things in. So the idea is that we never trust any user, any device that connects into our network, regardless of whether they were authenticated or not, regardless of where they're connecting from. We want to check the health of the user's device as well, to look for example, signs of infection, or whether their device that they're connecting from is not patched with the latest patches available from their operating system vendor, for example. We want to look for abnormal activity. There's probably no good reason why one of your remote worker call center employees should be accessing the customer database at 2 o'clock in the morning, for example, certainly not downloading large chunks of it. So if we see that kind of thing, we're thinking that's probably not good. That's probably some sort of compromise going on. We should do something about it. We also want to authorize users individually every time they make a request. We don't just want them to connect once and assume they're good forevermore. Every time they do something, we want to reauthorize them. Just because they were authorized 5 minutes ago to do one thing doesn't mean they're authorized to do that same thing now. So it's constantly rechecking. And what are we actually checking? Well, we're checking their device they're connecting from. Is it an allowed device, or is it some random piece of hardware that might be infected with something that we don't really want to connect to our network that they're trying to use to access? Something in a public Wi-Fi hotspot, for example. Maybe we don't like that idea. We're checking, of course, usernames and passwords, multi-factor authentication that Brian talked about last week, standard stuff to check in. We're also checking schedules, as I said. 2 o'clock in the morning is probably not the correct time for someone to be connecting into your business critical resources. So we're going to disallow that. Could disallow it after 7 o'clock at night, for example. Also stops the employees working too long. And finally, we're going to check the endpoint protection status. So that is, as I said, whether the device that's connecting is clean, has no infections on it, whether it follows patching policy, where potentially that device is located, how it's connecting into us, a whole myriad of different checks that we can do. We could do this mostly with a software app that your users will run on their PC to connect, similar to a VPN client connection, if you've ever had one of those. But it can also be done in some cases agentless, which is usually a browser plugin that's downloaded and installed into the browser. Every time they visit a website that's sort of on your hit list, then zero trust will be applied if you decided whether they can access that website or not. Salesforce, for example, might be one of those examples. Again, you might not want to allow employees to access Salesforce outside of business hours, for example. And finally, if you've got some hardware, physical hardware, so Internet of Things devices, let's say smart hubs or connected fridges, something strange like that. If you've got that in your office or in a home environment, That can also be zero trusted, but instead of installing software on that, because it's very much a sort of a closed black box environment, we can't install our own software on third-party IoT devices. We can do it by hardware ID. So when that hardware is connected to the network, we can kind of tag it and say, this is a fridge. What do we want to do with that fridge? Well, again, we probably don't want it to allow access to much of the rest of our network. It's a fridge. What does it need to do? So again, idea, we don't trust that fridge at all. Maybe we can give it internet access, which most things need, but that's it. We don't trust it to access anything else in our network. So next slide, please, Catherine. So again, diagrammatic form, if the words was too much, this is the general idea of applying zero trust. One of your users with their computer will authenticate into a cloud service or potentially your firewall, depending on what hardware setup you've got. It could be a firewall as a service in the cloud as well, which is when rather than running your own firewall hardware, you outsource it to someone like us who will look after it for you, but it's still sort of your firewall dedicated to you. It's the zero trust system will verify the identity of the person connecting, assuming that all their credentials, username, password, device location, etc., MFA, all good. It will return a policy and a list of resources that they're allowed to access. So that might be applications or websites, for example, Salesforce, Office 365, that they're permitted to access. And then every time they make a request into one of those authorized resources, key point here in the second diagram is point 2. We confirm the policy, the access and the endpoint, what we call identity, which is who they are, and context, that is where they're connecting from, whether their device is secured, whether their device is compliant with our policies. Every time they make a request, we're matching against that. So this is helping, again, to add all those extra barriers and layers in. It's not just about where they're connecting from or who they are. It's also about the status of what they're doing, what time of day it is, how clean their device is, etc. And assuming that's all allowed, then they're allowed to open a session to whatever it is they're trying to access. All that data is returned, and optionally, we can scan it on the way back, for example, for data loss prevention, stop leaking of, say, credit card details or other sensitive information. Okay, finally then, next slide, please, Catherine. How does this all apply to the cloud? Because the cloud is a very, as Justin said earlier, very distributed environment. We've become more reliant on it, but it's much larger than anything that we used to deal with, where offices had a single network that was on premise that we could secure much more easily. Everything's now distributed and all over the place. And although we've got the same number of employees and users potentially, we've now got a much larger digital footprint that we need to secure. How do we do that? We can add what's called a broker between what you do on your desktop and what you do in the cloud. It's called a Cloud Access Security Broker, or a CASB for short, because everybody in IT loves acronyms. And it's essentially a gateway that sits between you and the cloud. So everything that you want to do, very much similar to zero trust, will be authenticated against that broker, and then individual permissions assigned to each user based on a schedule, based on their status as to whether they can access, let's say, Salesforce at a particular time of day from a particular location. So rather than just allow them to access the Salesforce website and give them carte blanche, as you may do today, just to use it from wherever they are, we're looking at being much more restrictive. And by being more restrictive, should they become compromised, either their machine or as a person, we're making it more difficult for them to get access to things they shouldn't be able to access. And that means, therefore, that the miscreants and the bad actors, as we call them, can't access this material as easily. And finally, as I like to do, a picture, because it's worth 1,000 words. This is the basic idea. You've got all of your users, your buildings, your offices on the left-hand side, all connecting in to a central system that does everything. And that's something that we tend to call Secure Access Service Edge, or SASE, as another acronym, because we love them. And that has everything inside it. So if you go with a provider that offers a SASE service, it totally lives in the cloud. You don't need any hardware. You don't need to buy anything for it. It's a service. You connect into their SASE platform in the cloud, and it acts as that gateway, as that checkpoint, as those sets of gates and walls to everything else that you want to do on the internet with your employees. And it gives you centralized policy and control, allowing you to be compliant with any policies and processes that you do have to protect all those resources that sit behind it. And that could be software as a service. It could be just internet access. You don't want them to be able to access phishing websites, for example, that are fake bank logins. or to access malware sites that are known to host dangerous software. So we can block that now, protect your users and their devices even further. Or it could be things that you've got in infrastructure as service, in hosted cloud, in data centers, for example. All of this stuff is now sitting behind this one layer of security that you've enabled to help protect you from all kinds of different threats, inside and outside. And so that is really the summary of where we're at. That covers a sort of a big overview of where we go from the very basics of cybersecurity all the way up to some of the latest SASE type products today that are there to help you protect your business within the cloud. Over to Justin.
Thanks, Charles.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Can we have the slides down so we can see everyone, please? Lovely. And I'm going to ask, do we have any questions? If so, yellow hand up, please. Well, I thought that was riveting, Charles. And I hope you're going to give those slides to your new business clients when they sign up.
Well, I think, yes, it's, I think part of it's a difficult one because you go into a new business and they're very happy with what they've already got. But, you know, when a more professional person looks at it, they think we could definitely do a lot of work to tighten this up. You know, what you've got already is definitely quite loose, quite weak, and there's lots of potential directions that you could be attacked from. And even just simple segmentation, going back to earlier, splitting things up, thinking about, does this need to talk to this? If it's not, then just don't allow it. That's going to stop a lot of problems right out of the box. Is if you don't need to do that, just don't do it and don't allow it. If you leave everything open, you're just leaving yourself vulnerable to things you've not even thought of.
Well, we know you'll be going into with ITS into two very new, huge, brand new builds. So that's an advantage, businesses. Do we have any questions?
Catherine, do we normally put the final network slide up just to complete things?
I was going to say, you're going to wrap up, Justin.
We can do. Let me just share my screen again.
So just to wrap things up, the network the slide we're currently showing is the new network that's a joint venture between Digital Greenwich Cities, DGC, and ITS. We've created a business called Digital Greenwich Connect, DGC, as well. And this is the first phase of our network build in the borough. So this is pretty much SE18. So you've got the river at the top with the new Royal Arsenal Riverside, and then all the way up, if you will, to Plumstead Common. We are going to be extending this towards the peninsula and down towards Eltham in the next as the next phase of the development. That's just being finalised or discussed. The actual routes, the best routes are being discussed. So this is a brand new all fibre network that's been built. Was launched February, March time. We already have a lot of clients running off this network now. And Charles and I would be very happy to talk to any small businesses that you may know, or any of your internet service providers. We're a wholesaler, so we don't sell direct. We use our partner base, our ISP, internet service provider base, of which Charles is one. But we can talk to existing ISPs as well. We have 500 of those signed up, so the chances are small businesses are talking to our partners already, and if they're not, we're very happy to bring them on. This network is agnostic. It can be used by and for anyone. So that's the wrap up really. In order to avoid the cut-off of copper, in order to access the cloud, and in order to secure your cloud, you do need to think about the new generation of fibre connectivity that's now available. Thank you very much. that might have given someone somewhere a bit more time to think of a question.
Yes. Has it? Oh, no. Eunice, do you have any questions?
I've got a question, but
right.
if Eunice has got one, then I'm very happy that Eunice.
Okay. Nope, Trevor, over to you.
Yeah, sorry. Go on, Trevor.
Are you okay, Eunice? So
yeah,
I've got a sort of reflection. I think more than a question, but we may turn it into a question. And it really is about the sort of scale of the businesses. And you gave, I mean, it was a very good presentation and very informative. And I kind of think, I mean, you gave the example of a retailer or a restaurant. And I'm just wondering, I mean, in the chamber, there's a lot of small businesses and a very diverse range of businesses. And kind of in my day job, I work for a very large business, the council. And there is such a sort of difference in the capacity of those businesses and the nature of those businesses. I'm sort of, the question that can't quite form is that there's this issue of scale. Now, the principles that you've outlined must be common to all businesses, but someone like the council or one of the big businesses in the borough, or one of the big retailers will throw a huge amount of resources, and they'll have loads of IT support. In the case of the council, it's probably very closely linked to Microsoft or whatever. Whereas a small business this is very much a sort of an add-on afterthought, perhaps. I'm sure you say, well, it absolutely shouldn't be. So I'm just sort of intrigued as to sort of how this becomes relevant to all bits, or is relevant, but this is my difficulty with trying to form a question. to a small business that's just started up in a shared office space, they are not going to have the resources to throw a huge amount of money at this. No. A big company, that's probably
but it's what we do is
so really I suppose I'm just sort of trying to sort of navigate, well, how, in terms of chamber members, apart from the principals, how can the really small ones actually ensure they're secure as possible?
Yeah, no, you're totally right. As I say, it's a noise. It's a toolkit, right? So
there's a lot of, excuse me, Charles, there's a lot of background noise. Anyone?
It's not me, but
it was. Yeah, it's a toolkit, right? So there's a collection of a whole different range of solutions, of techniques, of prevention that can be put in place, and what's relevant depends on what the business is doing. So you're not going to go with the whole arsenal for, as you say, the tiny coffee shop with the small set, or not even with a guest Wi-Fi. Let's say they just run tills and phones. Well, a lot of that's going to be overkill. They're not storing any data, so you don't need data loss prevention. You want something probably to do with malware, provided they've got to the PCs that they're using in there, but that could just be a software client that's on their device. You may not need to segment that network. If they don't have CCTV, if they don't really have a payment system that's online, then you don't really need to do that to the same degree. So, as you say, it's applying the same techniques, but to a different degree, and not everything is going to be relevant for everyone. Most of the solutions and services are quite granular in the terms of the costs. So it's not like you have to pay for everything. You can pay for pieces and put it together like a jigsaw. So you bring in someone who knows what they're talking about, they're going to find those right pieces. They're going to identify the things in the business that need protecting and the best practices to put in place for those, and only use the right degree of protection. It's a balance, like everything always is. It's a balance. It's not a case of, you're trying to over fortify something that there's nothing there to protect, right? It's as you say, if you've got a council, you've got a lot of residents' data in the back end. That's something you need to protect very heavily. If you're a coffee shop that doesn't even store customer details, it just takes the odd card payment as people come in and out, suddenly that footprint of what you need to protect is minimal, and so you wouldn't want to pay or charge much for it. But that's the point. It's you bring in someone who knows what they're doing, they look at what you're doing in your business and they say, well, these are the things that you really should be putting in place, and these are the reasons why as well, so that you can understand them. I think that's very important when you go to see a customer, is explaining why you're doing it and the commercial benefits for that. Why is it worth paying this subscription to, say, have intrusion prevention here, or to have anti-malware, endpoint protection, or would it be worth your business of however many employees signing up to a SASE provider to protect all the cloud applications that you use? Again, maybe your business doesn't use any cloud applications, in which case that's irrelevant, you throw out the window. So yeah, your point is well made. The idea was to give an overview of sort of many of the techniques and the thought processes that we go through, but not to say that we're going to do all of those. That would be overkill.
I think what I'm interested in really is kind of whether we can offer some kind of assistance to businesses. I mean, I guess in my head I got the idea that there could be a health check that's offered discounted rates of chamber members, that brings together different sectors or size of businesses. So all the coffee shops that are members of the chamber are brought together.
There's certainly common themes. So as I said earlier, if you're using guest Wi-Fi and you're allowing people sitting in your coffee shop or your restaurant to access that, there's certain things you definitely want to think about protecting against. For example, blocking certain applications. There's no good reason that somebody should be sitting there downloading movies from illegally off the internet, and that potentially leaves you open to a copyright complaint from the movie companies, and that has happened. Not that those complaints are particularly litigious or anything, they're just a bit of a grumble and you sort it out. But if you have no protection at all, then you're leaving yourself open to an unlimited number of those and potentially some legal action down the road, and it's a relatively cheap and quick thing to fix. So yeah, there are templates, if you like, a bit like the restaurant study that I gave. That's a typical kind of cookie cutter, because they tend to have the same kind of devices that are in there: till systems, credit card processing, CCTV, sound systems. They tend to all be very similar in that regard. Maybe you trim them back a bit, maybe there's some extra to consider. But yes, yeah, potentially there's something to be looked at in a wider kind of, as you say, when we look at industry verticals, that particular ways maybe we could do.
Thank you very much, Charles.
Sorry, two other questions I can see. Yes.
Yeah. Before we take the questions, though, can I just, Trevor, I have an idea. We're all involved with the Greenwich Business Awards, which were just launched. And there's a perfect time actually for all the applicants, to remind them, of what, because they are going to have to do everything online, obviously, to enter. And so there is a market, that we can tap. And I feel our role as the chamber is to continually, make people aware, of what they have to do. And I think there is very good business support in Greenwich, and they'll all be, ticking the little boxes. So we will make sure that we do our bit, because we're actually emailing all our membership today about obviously in Greenwich, about the business awards. So, and there is that market of all the applicants. So we'll go to Eunice first, then Brian. Sorry.
No,
I was just going to say that yes, sorry. As Brian said last Wednesday as well, and really he sort of focused a lot more on than I did today deliberately. I think I've tried to keep things separate. A lot of it comes around education and information to users, and a lot of the exploits and vulnerabilities that are used are human error or human mistakes, let's say, where people do. I don't want to say silly things, but they do things that are not wise ultimately, but that's mostly through not understanding or not having been educated or informed. So there's a huge piece around that. And Brian spoke a lot more about that last week. But as I said on the sort of first slides I was coming to, that education and training is very important, because you can put all the best technology in place and someone will still screw it up.
And it is people unwittingly, because they don't understand, doing silly things.
That's it.
Eunice, over to you. What's your question?
Yeah, thanks, Charles, for your presentation. What I wanted to find out is that our current network at the moment, we're a small charity, but our current network is VoIP, so voice over IP. So we have our telephones connected to the LAN and everything. So is there an issue? Because you were mentioning about segmenting telephones
Yeah, it
from
depends. I mean,
computers. So I was just thinking, is that something we should be looking at, or?
without knowing the wider business, it's difficult to say. So you have to look at everything, holistically to see where they fit in the picture. Generally speaking, any installation I go into, phones go onto a separate network, and I think most other managed service providers that I know and work with would do a similar thing. Reason for that is phones are very specific. They have that one job to do. They don't do anything else. They don't need to talk to anything else with the rest of the network. So why would you let them sort of mingle with everything else that's going on? Also, putting them in their own network allows you to do certain things. For example, something called quality of service, which allows you to prioritize that voice traffic over anything else going on. So if lots of people are downloading big files, for example, they might be competing with your internet bandwidth for the telephones. You probably don't want that. You'd rather that the phones worked with crystal clear voice quality rather than start breaking up and dropping calls. Whereas everything else could take a bit of a back seat. So there's a potential reason to do that for phones specifically as well, so that you can prioritize the traffic on them. If you haven't noticed a problem, then you're probably not hammering it that much, so it's not such a big deal. But again, it's looking at everything holistically. I mean, if you're putting CCTV system on the same network as your phones, and maybe someone's exploited the phone and they've managed to therefore try and jump across the CCTV system and then look at everything you're doing all day long, probably not the best idea. So again, it's looking at what you've got, and it's an individualistic approach. It's not, there's no one size fits all. But yeah, you could segment the phones onto their own network if you've got IT people who can do that. That would help to secure them. No disadvantage really, and no real cost.
Charles, again, we've got a lot of interference coming in from somewhere. Don't know. Does that answer your question, Eunice?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much, Charles.
Okay.
Thank you.
Brian, your hand's down, but have you got a question?
There's two things really. One was just asking Trevor whether he was on my session last week. Is the recording available, Helen?
It is, and we will send it directly to Trevor to watch very soon.
Yes, do.
Yeah, I suggest we have at least a conversation, Trevor. We're cyber security consultants. We do health checks.
Excellent.
And the other thing was this one for Charles. What, in your view, what percentage, or not necessarily percentage, but do you see regularly data loss incidents occurring because of misconfigured cloud services?
Not in my customer base, but not as many of them use cloud services to that degree. But I think in the wild, you're right. Again, that comes down to that human error element, and that human and education is you can have the best security in the world, but if you leave the gates open or the doors open, then someone's going to take the opportunity for a visit. Yeah, I mean, there have obviously been large scale incidents of that in the world of misconfigured things, and yeah, it harps back exactly to what you said last week about having sensible policies and procedures in place, having things health checked, looking at it from that human policy and process angle as well, which is really the first step. Someone should be coming to you and say, let's build some processes and policies around what we do in our business. You have a look at what they actually do and their activities, and then they say, right, what technology do we need to bring in to make this happen? And that's kind of more of a step in and do it than start building, say, ISO compliance or anything like that. That's not what we do.
That was excellent, thank you. And if I can just say, we're hoping, if our planning goes well, we're hoping to have an in-person event meeting in sort of early October for us all to be able to recap, and then we'll make sure everything, people will be sent all the videos, and Brian's cybersecurity video from last week is up on the website, and we'll promote all of this in the October issue of Masthead. And hopefully, if the wind is in the right direction, we're all sailing together, we'll have had our event by then, and there'll be huge coverage in the glossy business magazine. So, and I think, Eunice, you've been really good because you've been to all three, haven't you? And Brian, yes,
I have.
There we go. So thank
you.
you so much. I apologize that our numbers are down today. I think some people are still in bank holiday mode, but we all know on the screen we're not. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.